everyone, and welcome to a virtual Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. Tonight, we're almost at the end of our week rediscovering Jane Austen, one of the world's most enduring and best-loved novelists, and perhaps Bath's most famous resident. Jane Austen lived in Bath for approximately 6 years. She and her family always left the city during the summer months to visit family and friends, returning in October for the start of the season. Her time here can be divided. The first 3 years weren't too bad, as she had her sister with her, which always helped, but the final 3 were difficult and sad. A very good friend was killed in a riding accident on her birthday, which was traumatic enough, but then a few weeks later her father died. It's understandable her memories of Bath aren't particularly happy, but her books invariably mention Bath, and 2 of them, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, feature the city extensively. Bath may have changed, but it's still possible to walk around in the steps of her famous characters, and of course were always used for filming her books, though actually I do seem to remember there was one occasion when we lost out to Dublin. Now, this evening's talk. Jane Austen and the slave trade is a very contentious subject. Many of Bath's architectural gems were built from slave trade money, or were at least connected to it in some way. I was trying to find someone to speak on it for our programme next year, so it was really lucky to discover our speaker tonight was going to give a talk on this very subject. She'd been booked to give it in July at the prestigious Jane Austen Society AGM in Chawton, but of course lockdown put an end to that, so it meant I was able to snaffle her for tonight. Karin Fernald was born on the Isle of Bute. After school, she trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art for a career in the theatre. As well as theatre work, she's appeared on television, in series like The Forsyth Saga. She's been in countless films and heard on radio. But from her love of literature and history, she's developed a series of lectures about some of the people she particularly admires, like Fanny Burney and the famous actress come mistress of George I, Perdita Robinson. She's given her extensive programme of one-man shows around the world to great acclaim, but she's also found the time to write a light-hearted biography for children about Queen Victoria's early life. So we're really delighted she's with us tonight, even if not in the flesh. So please, will you all welcome our speaker, Karin Fernald.
Diana, thank you very, very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I am delighted to be here at your lovely festival. Now, good evening, everybody. Throughout the lifetime of Jane Austen, as I'm sure many of you know, the transatlantic slave trade is a divisive political public issue. In the novels, Jane seldom mentions it. In letters, never. In life, reports her niece Caroline. In vain do I try to recall any expression or word of Aunt Jane's that had reference to public events. But there are clues, nonetheless, to what her thoughts may have been. Clues in Mansfield Park, in Emma, in the social climate of her day, and perhaps, too, not only in the works, but in the lives of some of her favourite authors. Now, here we see a great engineering feat of early 19th century England and a source of national pride. The West India Docks in East London, authorised by Parliament to be built for the West India Company in the year 1802. Jane Austen is 26 years old in that year, just moved to Bath with her parents. Now here on the far left, we see great warehouses stretching back into the distance. They may not look so big to us today because of what we're used to, but for Jane's day, they were colossal. Each warehouse could hold up to 8,000 barrels or hogs' heads they were called. Just one of these contains up to 80 gallons of beer or 1,500 pounds of sugar. To their right, we see a fleet of cargo ships or India men, each of which can hold either a large quantity of merchandise or, if adapted, up to 700 men, women, and children, chained to planks, lying flat, with not enough room to turn round. In our ships, says one captain, the great object is to be full. The slaves lie in 2 rows, one above the other, close to each other, like books upon a shelf. Well, years later, that captain, John Newton, will undergo a change of heart, convert to the abolition movement, and compose the hymn, Amazing Grace. Over the last 100 years or so, the Middle Passage between England, Southwest Africa, the islands of the Caribbean, and the southern states of North America have transformed the economies of Western Europe, not least the British, through trade in tobacco, cotton, and sugar, which in Jane Austen's day has been compared by the historian Adam Hochschild to oil in ours, in that it is crucial, so it seems, to the economy. Cane sugar. In Jane's day, the sugar beet, which requires only a temperate climate, unlike the cane, is just starting to be grown in quantity in France. Cane is the thing. From Southeast Asia, first grown by Westerners in the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean, but there the winters are cold. Madeira is a better bet, the Caribbean perfect. Here's an ad for an auction, both for sugar and for a ship, the Adventure, in which to go and get it. Risky trade, stakes are high. 2 years later, after just 3 voyages, this ship will be captured by a French privateer. But it's a risk investors are happy to take. Today, we're told to lay off sugar. In Jane Austen's day, people use it not only as sweetener and decoration, but as preservative, spice, and medicine for kidneys and eyesight, among other things, seemingly unaware of any link to their decaying teeth. One doctor actually recommends cleaning your teeth with sugar. Now, one wonders, might dental victims have included Jane's mother? By the time she was 43, Mrs. Austen had lost several front teeth. Had she fallen a victim to sugar? Back in medieval times, sugar was for the rich. In Jane's day, it's still something of a luxury. The Austens keep their cone-shaped loaves, not in kitchen or in larder, but in the dining room, locked up. Here's Jane writing to Cassandra about a lovely visit Cassandra's just received from Brother Charles and his young family. It's come to an end. They've gone home. You will miss them, writes Jane, but then the comfort of getting back into your own room will be great, and then the tea and sugar, the expense. For the last time, back to those docs and to their publicity. I'm going to turn off this little thing now, if I can get at it there, so we can just concentrate on the pictures. I'll come back a bit later on. Here's the advertisement for those great docs. Such is the enterprising spirit, commercial knowledge, and liberal conduct of British merchants, that their ships are welcome visitors to every part of the globe, says the publicity, enabling vast fortunes in the islands of the British-owned West Indies by means of that ancient system long accepted as a necessary evil which provides plentiful labour, reliable and cheap. And is it such an evil, working outside all day in the sunshine, your food provided? In the words of Samuel Johnson's biographer, James Boswell, lo then, in yonder fragrant isle, where nature ever seems to smile, the cheerful gang of negroes see perform the task of industry. Even at their labours hear them sing, as time flies quick on downy wing. Finished the business of the day, no human beings are more gay. Of food, clothes, cleanly lodging, sure, each has his property secure. Their wives and children are protected, in sickness they are not neglected, and when old age brings a release, their grateful days they end in peace. The Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade had been formed in 1787, Jane is 12 at the time, in the city of London, not far from here, by Quakers, who had long been against the trade and link up with evangelical Protestants in the hope of ending it. Here are some of its most prominent figures. Top left, Granville Sharp, musician and civil servant, driven to action by seeing a slave viciously beaten by his owner. Top right, Zachary Macaulay, a merchant who had witnessed horrors on plantations in Jamaica. In the middle, William Wilberforce, Member of Parliament, fine orator, crucial to the movement. Down left, another Quaker, Thomas Buxton, a brewer. And down right, most active of the lot, Thomas Clarkson. And from Nigeria, the remarkable Olaudah Equiano, captured in his homeland aged just 11, worked in North America to buy his freedom, gets to England, supports the abolition movement by sales of his highly successful autobiography. But in spite of these excellent men, and later some excellent women, abolition takes nearly a century in hard-won stages. Not for another 30 years will the transportation of slaves on British ships be pronounced illegal. The year after that, Thomas Clarkson writes a history of the abolition movement, which Jane Austen must have read, because, writing later to her sister about another author she admires, she says, "I am as much in love with him as I ever was with Clarkson," of whom more shortly. Like many English families then and now, the seemingly rural Austens have in fact many connections with the wider world, especially the Caribbean. On both sides of Jane's family, there are better-off cousins with plantations in Jamaica. Mrs. Austen's brother James has married an heiress to estates in Barbados. An ex-pupil of Jane's father has acres in Antigua, of which he has made George Austen a trustee, so that if he himself should die, Jane's father would have to take charge of the plantation and its slaves. Jane's younger brother Charles marries a daughter of the Attorney General of Bermuda, and when she dies, he marries her sister. Back home in peaceful Hampshire, there are wealthy neighbours who kindly pass on their newspapers to the hard-up Austens. These neighbours, who one might as well keep in with, have lands in Antigua. There is a shocking neighbour, William Beckford, bisexual and libertine, whose father is so rich he is known as the uncrowned King of Jamaica, all dependent on cheap labour. The country needs it to survive and prosper. If Britain abandons slavery, who's going to profit? Our enemies, the French. Slavery has always existed. Aristotle had no problem with it, nor did Adam Smith. It is precisely during the lifetime of Jane Austen that such attitudes start to change. 3 years before her birth, the Lord Chief Justice William Murray, Lord Mansfield, had given the very first anti-slavery judgment in England, ruling after much thought that there could be found no positive law in England to support the odious state of slavery, and therefore the owners of the slave James Somerset might not send him out of England and sell him. Lord Mansfield is hailed as a saviour, first by the Abolition Committee, later by the public. 10 years later, Lord Mansfield will appear again when, on her way from West Africa to Jamaica, a ship full of slaves gets lost, drifts in the ocean, having omitted to take on fresh drinking water. It runs out, slaves die. The ship's captain has a problem. How can he claim the insurance? Only under the law of England, if he can prove that the deaths are due not to negligence, but to perils of the sea, in which case he is allowed to jettison some cargo in order to save the rest. And under the maritime laws of England, slaves are cargo. The captain orders 133 of them to be thrown overboard. We can see their chains in front, that's all that's left. And later in England, he claims the insurance. They put up a fight. The claim is defeated, nobody gets any money, but nobody is tried for murder, and it is the same judge, Lord Mansfield, again giving a strict interpretation of the law, according to which slavery, illegal in England, is still legal on the high seas, and a slave is a piece of property like a horse or even a piece of wood. Now this case is hushed up, but word trickles out, fueling the abolitionists who gather speed. Others learn of it, including Joseph Mallord Turner, born the same year as Jane Austen. Years before he painted The Slave Ship, he had included the scene in a bitter poem, The Fallacies of Hope. Hope being the hope of selling slaves in the market. Now, Jane Austen belongs to the minor gentry, with proud connections on her mother's side to the major gentry. She drinks her tea, we know, without milk, surely with sugar, though we don't know for sure. She likes staying in nice houses, being looked after by servants, partly financed by the trade, no doubt. She loves her country. She loves her church, which sees nothing wrong with slavery and profits by it, as does the University of Oxford, from which father and 2 brothers have received scholarships. But it's quite interesting, surely, that at least 3 of Jane's favourite authors are passionate anti-slavers. Dr. Samuel Johnson, moralist and dictionary maker, Jane's favourite writer in prose, says Brother Henry. William Cooper, Jane's favourite poet, today rather forgotten, but in his own day widely read. And the man with whom she claims to have been in love, literarily speaking, that is, as far as we know, she never set eyes on him, Thomas Clarkson, most active of all the abolitionists. 6 foot tall, with red hair, though we can't see that under the wig, and with energy. Son of a clergyman, and like Jane, true child of the Anglican Church. We see him here as a theology student, 28 years old. 4 years earlier, at Cambridge, he had come across the slave trade by accident, by winning first prize in a Latin essay competition, and then entering for another one, whose subject just happens to be, is it lawful to enslave the unconsenting? He doesn't know whether it's lawful or not. He just wants another prize. So he does a bit of reading and finds himself looking at eyewitness accounts in detail by horrified observers of the various brutal ways in which Africans are captured, transported, made use of, brutally punished in a variety of sadistic ways, and sometimes deliberately burned to death. I had expected pleasure from the invention of my arguments, from the putting of them together, and from the thought that I was engaged in an innocent contest for literary honour. But my pleasure was damped by the facts which were continually before me. In the daytime I was uneasy. In the night I sometimes never closed my eyes for grief. It became now not so much a trial for academical reputation as for the production of a work which might be useful to injured Africa. He wins the prize, he translates his essay from Latin into English, and then on his way to London on horseback, riding through peaceful countryside, perhaps like this, I stopped my horse, I dismounted and walked. I tried to persuade myself that the contents of my essay could not be true. But the more I reflected, the more I gave them credit. Coming in sight of Wade's Mill in Hertfordshire, I sat down on the turf by the roadside and held my horse, and a thought came into my mind that if the contents of my essay were true, it was time some person should see these calamities to their end. He's got very good connections. He's got a comfortable future waiting for him in the Church of England. But he decides to print his essay. He looks round for a printer and just happens to bump into a Quaker printer in the city who takes one look at his essay and drags him towards a newly formed group of Quakers working for abolition. Now, Quakers are social outsiders. This is a painting from the previous century, but in Clarkson's day they still look like this. They are thought weird. They complain about the names of the days of the week being pagan names. They use numbers instead. They won't take those great hats off, even for the king. They're not allowed in universities or the civil servants, let alone government. I had ambition, a thirst after worldly interest and honours, and I could not extinguish it at once. But I felt certain there could be no success in this matter, except it should be taken up by one who would make it an object for the business of his life. And I urged to myself that never was any cause in any country or in any age so great and important. Never was the one in which so much misery was heard to cry out. Never was the one in which so much good could be done. And never one more worthy of the devotion of a whole life. And from the late 1780s and for years to come, he will ride thousands of miles on horseback round England, collecting eyewitness accounts of more horrors from ex-sailors on slave ships, and receiving death threats in Liverpool and Bristol. Surely it is of relevance that Jane Austen recalls having once been in love with this man. Now, there's another of her favourite authors who had always been against the slave trade. Jane never met him either. He died when she was 9, but at some young age, we don't know when, she had read his famous story of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, most likely through her literary brother James, 10 years older than she and a student at Oxford. James Austen looks sensitive here, doesn't he? And he hasn't got that tight little mouth that the other Austens have, including Jane. According to Brother Henry, it is James who directed his young sister's early reading, and so it could well be he who introduced her to Johnson, whom he much admired. Later, Jane goes right off Brother James, but as a child she'd looked up to him, the poet of the family, who had also written some very nice light verse in the person of a cat called Tiger. While at Oxford, James Austen started a weekly magazine modelled on Samuel Johnson's well-known Rambler periodicals. In respectful mockery, James calls his own magazine not the Rambler, but, ha-ha, the Loiterer. Well, not only does his young sister call the doctor her dear Dr. Johnson, but later in her poem, written on the death of her much-admired friend Anne Lefroy, Jane pays this friend the compliment of having been the first of women. As Dr. Johnson had been, writes Jane, Dr. Johnson had been the first of men. Well, the first of men. Strong statement. Samuel Johnson had died, famous, in December 1784, and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Jane's just 9 at the time, upon which no fewer than 13 newspapers had reported his very generous legacy to his black servant, Frank Barber. The doctor asked what he should leave this honest old servant who had lived with him about 40 years. He was told that a man of the first quality usually bequeathed no more to a faithful servant than £50 a year. Why then, said the doctor, tell Frank that I will be above a lord, for I will leave him £70 a year, which he does. Most of his friends disapprove, and it is reported by 13 newspapers. Little Frank Barber, this may or may not be him grown up, nobody's quite sure, had come to Johnson as a 10-year-old slave child, a sort of gift from an old friend whose father had estates in Jamaica. Johnson's wife, Elizabeth, had just died. He was half mad with grief and with guilt, for some fairly good reasons, and perhaps he might have expiated that, or hoped to, by the care he takes of the little black boy. Johnson feeds Frank, educates Frank, prays with him, both together down on their knees, not as master and servant, but as two souls equally in need of salvation. Johnson goes out to buy oysters for the cat, rather than ask Frank to, in case the boy should feel demeaned by serving an animal. Twice Frank runs away. Johnson's house is gloomy and dark and full of cross old people. Johnson gets him back, makes him finish his education, hoping to turn him into a scholar like himself. Frank would be with him at his death, and later the legacy was widely reported. The Austens would certainly have seen it. And 7 years later, when Boswell's biography comes out, Jane is 17 now, deep into reading and writing. The family could well have read in it of Johnson's famous toast. But according to Professor James Basker of Columbia University, New York, nobody at the time could have known the fervor and longevity of Johnson's anti-slave views. Back in the 1740s, he had described Jamaica thus. Years later, he passes the first judgment of Lord Mansfield that you can't send a slave out of England to sell him. Passes that on to lawyers in Scotland, acting for another slave. Boswell is suspected of concealing Johnson's views. None of this would the Austens have known, but they would have seen his famous comment, which would so rile Benjamin Franklin. How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? Jane's third favourite author, William Cooper, is yet another anti-slaver, partly, it seems, for personal reasons from childhood. Wretched due to the death of his mother when he was 6, he tries to kill himself, he fails, gets bullied at school, grows up to identify with all victims of injustice. He finds comfort in nature, will write poems, mainly about country life. To be heralded by Coleridge and Wordsworth as the pioneer of romantic poetry, and to be much appreciated by Jane, who writes in a letter that in her view, landscape must be among the joys of heaven. The sloping land recedes into the clouds, writes Cooper, displaying on its varied side the grace of hedgerow beauties numberless. Scenes must be beautiful, which, daily viewed, please daily, and whose novelty survives long knowledge and the scrutiny of years. Like Jane, William Cooper starts his religious life as an Anglican. In his late 30s, however, living in Buckinghamshire, he comes across that erstwhile captain of slave ships, John Newton, now an evangelical convert and passionate anti-slaver. Cooper converts to evangelicalism, and some of his thoughts become well known, except that few of us remember whose thoughts they are, especially this one. He puts together a book of hymns. More of his phrases go into the language. He composes a poem, The Negro's Lament, which becomes popular. And some years later he writes what becomes his best-known work, The Task, which, according to Paula Byrne, the Austen family read to each other in the evenings, and it becomes Jane's favourite poem. The Task is a poetic meditation on nature, religion, and England, attacking evils of the day. I had much rather be myself the slave and wear the bonds than fasten them on him. We have no slaves at home. Why then abroad? Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment they are free. A reconstruction of Thomas Clarkson's campaign chest, filled with things collected by him from crew members of slave ships. And he carries it with him as he rides round England in the late 1780s, showing it to people. Inside he's put useful and attractive products from West Africa other than slaves, ivory, legal of course, indigo cotton, seeds, spices, gums, leather sandals, bags woven from dried grasses. And as he tours Liverpool, Bristol, and London at increasing personal risk, gathering evidence for his campaign, he purchases objects made in England with great profit, and he shows them too. Leg shackles, handcuffs, a thumb screw, a lovely device used to wrench open a person's mouth to force them to eat. And then he shows his diagram of a fully loaded ship carrying Africans from the Gold Coast to Jamaica. At a time before photography, this image of human beings lying flat in the hull of a ship, like sardines, has a powerful effect. A wood engraving of the same scene, close up. His abolition committee has 7,000 copies printed to be hung on the walls of homes throughout the country. The Austens will certainly have seen it, together with this famous medallion by Clarkson's friend, the hugely successful potter Josiah Wedgwood. This, too, would be mass-produced. Ladies wore it in bracelets or as pins for their hair, writes Thomas Clarkson. The taste for wearing it became general, and so fashion, which usually confines itself to worthless things, is seen for once promoting justice, humanity, and freedom. In the year 1788, the Austen sisters, in their mid-teens, 100 petitions to end the slave trade are presented to Parliament from all over the country. 3 years later, however, a bill to end it is turned down in Parliament. Too many MPs have nice investments in the West Indies and there's been lobbying. But around the country at large, the movement gained support, kicking off something new in England, though not new in the young United States of America, which has invented it, a boycott, not of tea, as in Boston, but of sugar. There was no town through which I passed, writes Thomas Clarkson, from Cornwall to the North Sea and from the Midlands to the Highlands of Scotland, in which there was not some one individual who had left off the use of sugar. In the smaller towns, there were from 10 to 50 people, in the larger, from 2 to 500, of all ranks and parties, rich and poor, churchmen and dissenters. Even grocers had left off trading in it. Children give up sugar. One little boy stops polishing his shoes because someone tells him shoe polish has sugar in it. And in some households, the women stop cooking with sugar. On returning to my home, I found the females in my absence had perused a pamphlet causing them to leave off sugar and to banish it from the tea table, says one furious householder. In Hampshire, in Dorset, in Southampton, Portsmouth, Dorchester, and in some little villages, Cerne Abbas, Sturminster Newton, ordinary people who don't yet have the vote are still getting up petitions against the slave trade. Admired figures from the arts get involved. Hannah More, evangelical writer and teacher, Lake poets Wordsworth, Coleridge, James William Cooper. It is hard to believe the Austens can have remained untouched, though as minor gentry and poor relations, they might well have been reluctant to mention it. And at the same time, events across the Channel are bringing about in this country a crackdown of liberal sentiment, a dread of anarchy. In France, they murder their king. In the Caribbean comes a slave rebellion which succeeds. In England, the establishment senses its back to the wall. For some years now, the king has been mad on and off. Nobody can stand the idea of the next one, especially women, including Jane. Our south coast is threatened by the French. Young Jane writes her early novels in a time of such fear. It has been compared by one historian to what it might have been like living behind the Iron Curtain. The crime of treason, once narrowly confined to plotting to overthrow and kill, casts its net wider to include writing or just distributing an even slightly lefty-type leaflet. And you can go to prison for publishing it. And a woman writer, surprise, surprise, is particularly exposed. Henry Austen's memoir of his sister makes her sound completely taken up by her home life. All she ever wanted, he says, nothing mattered to her but her family. Her principal talent was sewing. Biographers to take issue. But clever brother Henry has his reasons. According to another female novelist of the day, women writers are tried in the court of public opinion, not merely as writers, but as women, while malignant ingenuity is unwearied in finding out their errors and exposing their foibles. So, if you want to sell your dear sister's writing, alive or dead, take care what you say about her. 3 years before Jane's birth, slavery in England itself has been put a stop to by Lord Mansfield. Partly due to the wars with France, it takes another 30 years for things to move on. Not till 1807 is a stop put to the carriage of slaves on British ships. A few years after that, living now in the village of Chawton in Hampshire, 38-year-old Jane Austen composes her new novel, and she gives it the name, not of a person or of a pair of abstract qualities, but of a fictional and beautiful property and estate. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, had died back in 1793, but his name is still well known, connected with that first anti-slavery judgment, not the second. Now, he had lived near Hampstead in the stately home of Kenwood, designed by Robert Adam. Not only had he ruled that a slave can't be abducted from England by force, but Lord Mansfield had actually taken into his grand house an illegitimate child of colour, Dido Elizabeth Bell, child of his own nephew, Sir John Lindsay, and a slave woman from the West Indies. The Mansfields had no children. They have Dido educated alongside their own great niece here, Lady Elizabeth, and not only does Lord Mansfield leave Dido well off at his death, he also leaves her his own very fine portrait to be hung in her room to remind her of him. She is said to have had great spirit. Now here's another girl, a littler girl, rather different from Dido, white for a start, but also a poor relation, a shy, frightened little Fanny Price, here on the left, who comes to beautiful Mansfield Park, title of Jane's third novel, as the niece of Sir Thomas Bertram, its owner. Here's little Fanny with the bone-idle Lady Bertram, who cares only for her little pug dog, as we see here on the left, and for snoozing on the sofa, as we see on the right. So Fanny is left alone to be bullied by her awful aunt, Mrs. Norris, here on the left. And Fanny's situation at Mansfield Park has been compared to slavery by various scholars, though never by the author. Fanny grows up to have character and strength with which to deal with painful situations, to refuse her rich young admirer here on the right, Henry Crawford. Mansfield Park is supported by sugar plantations on Antigua, worked by slaves. Fanny is the only character in the novel who dares mention the trade to their owner, Sir Thomas, her uncle. She doesn't get far because, she says later, there was such a dead silence from Sir Thomas's daughters who were there at the time. This dead silence has been the subject of much guesswork. Are the girls bored? Are they mildly embarrassed? Or are they painfully aware that their lifestyle is supported by the degradation and torment of others? The author doesn't say. The dead silence just hangs in the air. Back to Mrs. Norris, who treats Fanny like a slave. Jane Austen will certainly have read in Thomas Clarkson's book of a real-life slave trader of that very same name, Norris, of particularly bad repute, loathed by Clarkson, who tells us all about him. The name Norris might just have stuck in Jane's mind. Another name in Mansfield Park is that of a well-known London street, Wimpole Street, connected today with well-off doctors and dentists. In Jane Austen's day, Wimpole Street was still more prosperous than it is today, being the abode of wealthy families profiting from the slave trade. One real-life name, that of Lascelles, appears in Mansfield Park among the friends of the very dubious brother and sister from London, Henry and Mary Crawford, and this connection with wealthy Wimpole Street could well be the author's way of indicating to us that these Crawfords are not to be trusted. Well, these widely known names, Mansfield, Norris, Wimpole Street, Lascelles, belong to pro- and anti-slaving groups, well known in Jane's day. It's a bit hard to believe that she didn't know. What her intention might have been in putting those names in her book is hard to guess. It is her next novel, Emma, which contains her only direct comment on the slave trade, together with another interesting name, which she gives to another nasty character, though not as nasty as Mrs. Norris. This name is Hawkins. Back in the days of Elizabeth I, there was a real-life Sir John Hawkins, pirate, navigator, first English slave trader. Not his idea to start with. For years the Portuguese and Spanish had been at it. Sir John takes a good look at their profits and decides to do likewise. Back to Emma. Here she is on the left, putting a kindly pillow behind the head of her old father. And here she is on the right at her easel, with her smarmy admirer, the clergyman Mr. Elton, who is looking naturally for a rich wife. Turned down by Emma, Mr. Elton gets hold of a Miss Augusta Hawkins from Bristol, with 10,000 a year. Miss Hawkins, says the narrator, was the daughter of a Bristol merchant, of course, he must be called, implying that coming from the slave port of Bristol, he could well be a trader. They're fairly well off, especially her elder sister was very well married to a gentleman in a great way, near Bristol, who kept 2 carriages. One of these carriages is a show-off vehicle known as a barouche landau. The new Mrs. Elton is always on about it, and about Maple Grove, her brother-in-law's grand home, to which she tries to compare Emma's home in order to flatter her. And it is not merely the house, the grounds, I assure you, are strikingly like, says Mrs. Elton to Emma. The laurels at Maple Grove are in the same profusion as here. My brother-in-law and sister will be enchanted by this place. People who have extensive grounds themselves are always pleased with anything in the same style. Emma had an idea that people who had extensive grounds themselves cared little for the extensive grounds of anybody else. It is through Mrs. Elton that we can read Jane Austen's one and only direct comment on the slave trade. She turns up again talking to Jane Fairfax, a beautiful, poor young woman, who is having to apply for a position as a governess. She knows not where, she knows not who with, she hates the idea, and she's dragging her feet. Get on with it, says Mrs. Elton, and she offers to recommend Jane to a ghastly-sounding woman called Mrs. Bragg. Thank you, says Jane, but I would rather you did not mention me to Mrs. Bragg. I do not wish to be giving anybody trouble, for I am not afraid of being long unemployed. There are places in town, offices, where inquiries would soon produce something, offices for the sale, not quite of human flesh, but of human intellect. Oh, my dear, human flesh, says Mrs. Elton, you shock me. If you mean a fling at the slave trade, I assure you my brother-in-law was always rather a friend to the abolition. And the word rather might imply mixed feelings. I did not mean, I was not thinking of the slave trade. Governess trade, I assure you, was all I had in view. Widely different as to the guilt of those who carry it on. But as to the greater misery of the victims, I do not know where it lies. The guilt of those who carry it on. The only straightforward opinion given in all the novels of Jane Austen. Now, George Austen, Jane's father, has been dead now for quite a few years. We will never know his views on the slave trade, but we know that at least 2 of Jane's brothers disapproved of it, but at different times and under different circumstances. Years after his sister's death, Frank Austen, future Admiral of the Fleet, is mapping the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic and making very careful notes of its customs. The practice of slavery, he writes, is not here so harsh and inhuman as in the sugar islands of the Caribbean, and yet slavery, however it may be modified, is still slavery. And Frank goes on to regret that any trace of it should be found to exist in countries dependent on England, or colonized by her subjects. Well, now, Frank expresses that view some years after slavery has been outlawed within the British Empire. His view is mainstream. Years before, when its principal opponents consist of Thomas Clarkson's Abolition Committee, together with those outlandish Quakers in silly hats, in his magazine, The Loiterer, young James Austen described slavery as a misery, a blot that disgraces the annals of trade. And this is years before Clarkson publishes his own history of the abolition, to be read by Jane among many others. Who has young James been reading? Had he heard Thomas Clarkson speak somewhere? We don't know. There's no record of Clarkson addressing students at Oxford, as he had done at Cambridge, but it's not impossible. Not for many years would the trade finally be abolished throughout the British Empire, by which time Jane Austen had been long in her grave. In her final years, as she had anticipated in a short poem, when stretched on one's bed, with a fierce throbbing head, which precludes alike thought or repose, how little one cares for the grandest affairs that may busy the world as it goes. Our own bodily pains, every faculty chains, we can feel on no subject beside. 'Tis in health and at ease we the power must seize for our friends and our souls to provide. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Karin. That was absolutely wonderful. Really, really interesting. Now, I know you're very kindly going to answer questions, so I'm going to ask our audience if they will have any questions. They've got 3 different ways of doing it. They can put a question into the chat room. They can raise their hands if I can get into the full screen. And I can see 1 or 2 people. Or they can just, oh, I can see a few more now. Well, you're all very welcome. Is there anybody who would like to start the ball rolling? Because this has been a really, really good evening, and I'm sure you must have, some of you must have questions to ask Karin. So put them into the chat if you'd like, or raise your hand. Gallery view, I'm seeing quite a few people now. I know we've got Paula. We've got a question from Hilary Robinson. Will the text of your talk be published? So, Karin, there we are. There's your first question.
No, not that I know of.
No. Oh, well, have we got anything else? Oh, I can see Marion. Hello, Marion. You managed to get in tonight. That's good. Who else have we got? I think, we've got Betty. We've got Michael up there. Oh, we've got Dilys back again. Hello, Dilys. Nice to see you here.
Diana, can you...
I can go further along and see we've got Janet. Excellent.
Diana, can you not take my video off?
Who's that? Sorry.
That's David. It's David.
Yeah.
It keeps telling me that you have muted my video.
Yeah.
Have I?
Yep.
I don't know how I did that.
Fine. That's great. Thanks. Thanks.
It wasn't,
there
you are, David. Hello.
Thanks. Thanks.
No, it wasn't me. I'm innocent on that one. Nice to see you. Have you got a question?
Only a comment, but leftovers go first.
Paula, is that? I can't see you, Paula.
Maybe, David, you ask your question first before Paula comes on.
H-I-L-D, and it's called Bury the Chains. And there's a lot in there. It's very readable. Adam Hochschild, Bury the Chains.
I see you're all writing that down. Jolly good.
Oh, I recommend it.
Right. Oh, wait a minute. I've got a comment here. Very interesting that Jane, in her characteristic way, outlines her thoughts. Is that? I'm not quite sure what that word is. I think it's that her thoughts, puts her thoughts forward so subtly. This is absolutely true. It is extremely subtle the way she does it. And I suppose really that is at the heart of everything she wrote. She was incredibly subtle.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody else? I've got the chat open. Oh yes, Marion. Okay, lovely. What do you want to say?
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you, Karin. I mean, that was a really, really fascinating talk with so much detail about what was happening in that period. That was, you know, thank you so much for that. But if I could ask you a question, going back to Mansfield Park, when, as you referred to the time when Fanny did sort of raise the question with her uncle, and then, as you say, the dead silence of the sisters, of her cousins. But does Edmund say to Fanny afterwards that if she had pursued her question, her uncle would have been pleased to answer her? Which
Yes.
I've always thought it's really odd. Well, why didn't Edmund do that himself?
Good question.
Yeah. Absolutely.
No answer to that, I'm sure, but it's just one of those things. If he's telling Fanny, well, you could have, you know, asked him, another, he would have answered you. Well, why didn't he do it?
Yes, quite. No idea, but quite right. He should have done. Not everyone's that keen on Edmund.
Interesting character, yes, yeah.
I've got a comment here from Richard White. Fascinating presentation, thank you. Would you like to offer some further commentary on the dead silence? We're back to the dead silence again.
No, I don't know either. I haven't the faintest idea. I've offered some.
Well, I think he goes on to say the dead in the context of the legacies of slave ownership and Black Lives Matter.
Yes, quite. I think it was Edward Said who first picked up the dead silence. Well, surely we can only offer our own interpretations of.
That's true. Go on.
I think, and I would imagine. Oh no, the only thought I think is that possibly Jane had experienced dead silences herself in social life when she or anybody else even faintly referred to the slave trade. I think it was an incredibly touchy subject, but you did not mention it. It wasn't done. That is what I suspect. I think she got that dead silence from her own experience at some stage. That's my guess. It can only be a guess.
Pretty good guess, actually. I think if I remember correctly, Fanny Price goes on to say, I didn't want to put myself forward in
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's what she did. Just to appear to be more interested in St. Thomas's doings and his own daughters.
Yeah,
that's right. But I think it would have been one of those sort of muddy situations when there would be all sorts of reasons for just shutting up.
Indeed.
I'm sure that was part of it. But the silence of the girls, they really just deeply uncomfortable. They didn't want to hear anything about it.
No, quite significant, yes.
Edward Said, I think, was the one who picked it up. I forget what was that famous book he wrote. That forgotten. It'll come to me.
I've got Mary Fagan wanting to ask a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to type it, Mary?
It doesn't allow me to type it because it says BRLSI is not on Zoom for some reason.
Oh, that's a bit odd. I've got it.
Yeah.
Zoom group.
When you go into the, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you
Yeah,
perfectly.
can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, it only seems to be with the writing the question in for some reason, because when I had the question typed in, but it just wouldn't go.
Oh well, that's a shame.
I'll try. I'll see if I left it there just a second now.
Can Mary ask it verbally, the question?
Yes. Can you
Yes,
voice
certainly.
it?
Do you think that Jane Austen considers the position of women in some respects as analogous to a slave, or identifies with a slave? Because we have the governess being as considered slavery, and I think in Northanger Abbey when what's the name of the heroine is being kidnapped, Catherine, is it? She is being taken. She's been kidnapped on a journey to a castle that's owned by a sugar planter or something, Blaise Castle.
Oh yeah, Blaise Castle. Yes.
Yeah, I think it was owned by somebody who made money out of the sugar trade.
Yeah.
I think at the time there were quite a lot of parallels drawn between the position of women in marriage and slavery. I think it was cottoned onto at the time. I can't do chapter and verse on that, but
Yes.
I think there were parallels which were picked up quite quickly.
Yes.
And have been again since.
Thank you.
All over the place.
Indeed. I've got another question from Richard. Do you think this is an early articulation of white fragility?
How interesting. An early indication of white fragility. Yes, indeed. Now, one thing, nobody ever in Mansfield Park says much about Lady Bertram. Everyone says, oh, she's terribly idle, she doesn't do anything. Nobody goes into Lady Bertram at all. I mean, she's either utterly frightful or there are reasons. But anyway, she, I would say, is an example very much of white fragility. I mean, she should be the heart of the household, and she isn't at all.
No, not at all.
Lady Bertram, I would have thought there would be a wee bit more about her somewhere, but I think white fragility, certainly.
I've got a question here from Sabine.
Oh, yes, I see it.
Oh, can you read it? Oh, excellent.
Yeah, well, if all men are born equal, how would the... No, it's gone now. Why are women something or other?
Shall I read it?
Yes.
Mary Astle in 1704 asks, if all men are born free, how come that all women are born slaves? This comes in her reflections on marriage.
Hooray, excellent. Yes, thank you. Mary Astle, yes.
And I've got a question now from Janet. What is the significance of Mrs. Smith's property in the West Indies and Captain Wentworth sorting it out? Now, indeed, yes.
Oh, I can't do that one. I haven't read that one for a while. Diana, over to you. Over to you.
Well, it's a very
persuasion.
interesting question. I don't know whether
Mrs.
Janet's
Smith's
got any
property,
thoughts on the subject herself. Have you any thoughts at all, Janet, on that? No, I'm not hearing her.
Janet is muted.
She's Janet, you've muted yourself.
Yeah, unmute yourself, Janet.
Can you unmute yourself?
No.
No.
Yes.
Yes, oh, she has. Oh, well done.
Where are you?
Yeah.
Janet.
Hello.
She's there. What, Janet? You
No, I don't have a. Yes, I don't have a view on it.
What do you think is the significance of Mrs. Smith's property and Captain Wentworth?
It's a concern of mine because it's incorporated into the story and it has to fit with the way things were seen at the time.
That's absolutely true, yes.
But it is a concern.
Are we reading some deeper significance into it?
Well, it was a normal way of owning income. That's the way I see it,
Yes.
in that no attention is drawn to it.
No, that's absolutely true. It's just something that she would have done or would have had as a matter of course.
That's it, yes.
But that's an interesting point to ponder. Perhaps we can think about that and come up with a solution. Is that Dilys raising her hand? Or no, it's David.
Yes,
It's David, right. Hello, David. What do you want to say?
I just wanted to comment that I like the way our speaker draws a distinction between the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and then the abolition of slavery within the British Empire in 1833. There is quite a big distinction. But just to chip in about Jane Austen's brothers, Frank and Charles, I do get them a bit muddled, but certainly after the abolition of the slave trade, one of them, I think it was Frank, was put on the West Africa squadron, which cruised up and down the Atlantic trying to stop ships and to stop the slave trade across the Atlantic. And of course, they stopped ships that weren't British as well. And the people who took most exception to this was the Americans, who were busily shipping the black cargo across the Atlantic. And Frank was involved with this. So Jane would have known a lot about it at that time. And it is one of the reasons given for the outbreak of the War of 1812 between America and the United Kingdom at that time. And that's one of the reasons the Americans give. And it's very interesting for me when I did a bit of research on this. If you read the British websites of history on this subject, you find out just what I've described, that the ships were being stopped. And when they were stopped, of course, if the British saw any defectors or people who had fled from British ships, deserted, they would take them off. But then, of course, if they saw a few handy chaps as well, they might take them off as well. If you read the American websites, the war broke out because the British were stopping the ships and taking sailors off. They don't mention why the ships were being stopped. It's sort of covered up. Anyway, I'll just chip that in because they were actively involved. I think it was Frank who went on to become the admiral. So Jane would have heard it firsthand from her own brother.
Certainly. I've got a few more questions here. One is from, is it Keris? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you see a parallel between the modern Irish slave myth perpetuated by some on the far right and the comparison of women's position with slavery in Jane's time?
Not a clue. The Irish, what's this about Irish slaves?
Yep.
Yes.
There is this myth perpetuated by the far right.
Oh, yes.
The Irish slave was very much in focus during Jane Austen's time, as I understand it. And of course, there is a comparison with women's position in the same period, because I suppose I don't know. Is this what you're talking, Keris? I can't see where you are. Am I in the right window? No, I'm not sure that I am actually. I can't see you at all.
Bottom left.
Irish slave myth. Yep. Was that slavery was no worse than Irish indentured workers.
Oh, right, there she is.
Ah, okay. I'm sure that may well be true in many cases. The Irish slave myth, that it was just as bad to be an Irish indentured worker as a slave, sounds quite reasonable.
Oh, yes, I'm sure it was true.
Well,
I've got another question. Sorry?
This has been a long-running myth, but the distinction between indentured servants and slaves was very well distinguished at the time. The main thing is that indentured servants were paid, but also that their children were not automatically born into slavery. Whereas with slaves, their children were born slaves.
Yeah. Mm.
So there can be a distinction made, but it's a tricky one. It's not something that we have nowadays, indentured servants, where they couldn't leave for 7 years.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Can you hear me now, Diana?
Yes, I can now.
Oh, sorry, I just unmuted. Yes, the point is, it's in modern times, it's a way of kind of playing down how bad slavery is by sort of belittling it as no worse than indentured labour.
Mm. Well, thank you for that. Thank you, David, as well. Yeah.
I mean, it seems a little bit of an exaggeration. However feminist you are, it seems a bit of an exaggeration to suggest that women's position was as bad as slavery when you were someone like a governess.
Well, it's an interesting comparison. And Jane Austen, as far as I know, was really, really terrified of the fact that you could be a governess. It was one of the worst possible things that you could be. And of course, we get the Bronte sisters, Anne Bronte, who writes that book about being a governess and how awful it was. And I'm sure it was just as bad in Jane Austen's day. We have a few more comments here. Hilary Robinson is saying the property being in the West Indies means it's very difficult for Mrs. Smith to sort it out herself. And we've got a comment here from somebody calling herself Black Girl Love Jane. She says, I agree. I'm not quite sure which bit she's agreeing with. Maybe...
Hi, I agree with...
Hello.
Hello, I'm from the U.S. So I agree with, I think it's Karen's comment about the equivocation of the governess and slavery and African slavery, because the one thing that the difference between the governess and the African slave is the governess in some shape or form could find herself out of that position, where if you were Black, there was really no way, you really, didn't have a choice, where the governess could find herself out of that way, maybe if she got married, or maybe if she got lucky to inherit something like in Jane Eyre. But if you were Black during that time, there was no way out. That was it. That was your life.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of hard to equivocate those two things to say they could be on par, because really there was no par.
No, that's a very good point. Being Black was, and it still is one of the most difficult things. Where are you speaking from? Are you in this country?
I'm from Ohio in the United States of America.
Oh, right. Well, it's lovely to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us. I've got a few more questions here. From Marion Davis. Charlotte Bronte was very critical of Jane Austen's book. She must have missed Jane Fairfax's comments in Emma. Yes, that might very well be true. And Mary Fagan is saying Edward Said's book is called Culture and Imperialism. So if anybody wants to make a note on that, it's Culture and Imperialism, the particular book. Was that Paula trying to say something?
Yes, I'm failing both to get my video or even to manage to send a chat, but I was going to also comment on Edward Said's book, Culture and Imperialism, and how helpful I've always found it.
Oh, well, that's
so there we go. Video. Thank you.
Oh, no, look, there you are. Hello. Well, thank you for that, Paula. So I'll just repeat that. Culture and Imperialism by Edward Said. If anybody, oh, look, there we are. If anybody is interested in further reading. I've now got something from Simon Ingram Hill. I'm not quite sure if I'm doing this correctly.
Yes, you have. That's
Is that
perfect.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Jane Austen created many clergymen. Did any of them oppose the slave trade and slavery? And if not, why not?
They don't mention it.
Oh. Why not?
Ah.
Yeah.
Well, we know about the Anglican Church, don't we?
Indeed.
They had the Codrington estate on Barbados. That was for which I think the last Archbishop of Canterbury apologized in public not long ago. Yes, it would have been difficult for the it wasn't the Anglicans did not object to slavery. It was these outsiders who were against it. The Anglican Church, on the whole, officially made no objection whatever and did nicely out of it. So I think it's unlikely that any of her clergymen would have complained. And anyway, yeah.
I think her clergymen it was basically a sinecure. They were not necessarily, with the possible exception of Edmund Bertram, they were not necessarily doing it out of a vocation. They were doing it because they hadn't got any other option.
Yeah.
But her father was a clergyman.
Yes, and one does wonder about him. One does wonder, but he's not there anymore. He died before much was done. One does wonder about George Austen. He was indeed. Well, I would love to know what his sermons were like.
Yeah.
We haven't a clue. We don't know. No. Was he boring? Was he any good? I think he's said to have been good. He's said to have been good. Jane, too, is said to have been, I think it was one of the nieces who said that listening to her read out of Fanny Burney's Evelina was as good as being at the play. And I read it somewhere that she got this good talent for speaking, partly from her father.
Could I just ask a follow-up about Bath Abbey? Because there's quite a lot of work being looked at about the whole slavery and these associations with slave trade. I don't know if there's any mention in relation to Jane Austen herself, but certainly because of the Bath Association.
Well, all I can say is that a lot of Bath was unfortunately built out of slave labour. A lot of the famous set pieces, Pulteney Street, for example, the Crescent, Queen Square, these were men who had some link with the slave trade in some way. They may not necessarily have owned slaves, but they certainly had links with them. And at the moment, there is a great deal of discussion in Bath about this question. We've even had somebody suggest that we change the name of Great Pulteney Street to something else. But again, this is a very contentious question. It's a very difficult question.
Paula has a question, but you're muted at the moment, Paula.
It's really interesting to read David Olusoka, is that how you say his name? Did a really interesting program in relation to the compensation money that was given to slave owners. And actually he just said, I think we just have to recognize how completely and utterly compromised we are as a country, because almost every institution is tied up with it, and just the complexity of it. Well, that's not to let anyone off the hook, but I just thought that was interesting hearing him say that. Yeah.
Absolutely. If I could chip in there, as Diana knows, I also live in Bath and work at number 1, the Royal Crescent, and we have the lists there of all the slave owners who had invested in the estates in the West Indies. When slavery was abolished, vast amounts of compensation was given to these people for the loss of their slaves. And that was a huge debt on the British government, which has only relatively recently been paid off. And We have the lists of the people who got the money, many of whom did improvements to their houses through the money. The same in the new town of Edinburgh. They have the lists there of people who received this compensation. And there was almost anybody, and all the institutions were involved in this. There's huge numbers. It's not just one or two individuals. No. It was almost the norm.
Yeah. I've got another comment here from Jean Walton. Many clergymen would have relied on wealthy patrons who may have been plantation owners. And of course, that's also very true.
Sorry, just to chip in again, sorry. Earlier, your speaker mentioned Beckford, and of course, he was owner in not the Royal Crescent, but Lansdowne Crescent, and all the way up the hill to Beckford's Tower. I mean, his father owned vast amounts of property and plantations and slaves, which his son spent his life selling off to fund his lifestyle.
Yes, indeed. I've got another comment here. This is interesting from Fiona. Is this subject covered in the curriculum in UK schools? Now, does anybody have the answer to that one? Because no. I'm not a teacher.
But I think it depends on the school.
I'm sure that's true.
And the type of school.
Yeah.
So I don't know, to be honest. But in some of the private schools, it may be covered much more. So I think it depends.
Yes, I think that's probably very true. It would depend entirely on the school. I've got another question here from our friend over in Ohio. Yes. The Sanditon mini-series has the scene with Miss Lamb and the rotten pineapple. Many in the USA were using the pineapple as cute moniker for the series. There was little backlash here in the USA. Was there any backlash in the UK? I don't know, because I never saw that particular series, the Sanditon one. So does anybody have the answer to that? There's a stony silence. Obviously, nobody has.
Dead silence.
The only reason why I asked is because it was during the time of Mr. Floyd, George Floyd, being killed. And so at the same time, we were finishing here in the US these series of Sanditon on what we call PBS. And so the moniker was kind of going around, and they were using it on different websites and Facebook pages here in the US, who were very excited about Sanditon in the series. But the pineapple scene, and particularly people were using it as a moniker for, Sanditon is about to come on or whatever. And then a few people here in the United States, including myself, we wrote different posts about how it was not as cute as people thought in regards to, the plantations, slavery, the colonization of the Caribbean. And so in the scene, for those of you who haven't seen it, they hold a dinner for Miss Lamb. And so and I'm not sure how far in this into the book, because she only got 11 chapters, and so Andrew Davies takes over. But they hold a dinner for her, and the host says, "Hey, we have something for you. We've been holding this pineapple for about 5 years. It's precious, it's glorious, because it came from the Caribbean, and we've been holding it, and we want to celebrate you coming." And then when they chop it open, all these maggots come rushing out of the pineapple. And it was just really, I believe, Andrew Davies' commentary about colonization and Miss Lamb, and just how she would have been treated somewhat in the UK and Britain at the time as this, exotic thing, just like this pineapple, to be showed off to the rest of the colonized world, or in Great Britain. But people were taken as a moniker, and some people really got offended. So I was just wondering if there had been any kind of backlash there in the US, in the UK, and I guess not. So
I'm not aware of it myself. There might very well have been, but as I say, I took rather exception to the adaptation of Sanditon, the imagined adaptation of Sanditon.
Yeah.
So I didn't watch it. I'm very sorry. I can't admit to anything on that at all. But I'm interested in what you said.
Can I ask, what does the lady mean by moniker? I don't understand her word.
Like well, maybe that was the wrong term. Maybe an emoji. So they would put on their post a pineapple.
Ah, right. Yes.
And then say Sanditon and hashtag, or they would just put a whole bunch of pineapples, you know, as their comment regarding something that maybe happened that night on the series. And you know, it just became the thing, and Instagrams and things regarding the series and regarding, you know, the show in itself. Well, missing the point that I felt as an African American of what Mr. Davies, I believe, was trying to say in that scene.
Well, thank you for that. I've got somebody who's saying thank you for a fascinating talk and question and answer. Does anybody else have any more questions? I think some people are thinking that it's time for their steak and chips or cup of tea.
Can I ask?
Dilys is saying bye-bye. Bye-bye then, Dilys.
No, I'm not saying goodbye.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, and it's referring to Dido in the daughter of the slave, the slave girl whose father was a white Englishman, and wondering, because I watched the Sanditon miniseries, wondering whether in the fragments that Jane Austen wrote about Sanditon was somebody like Dido involved.
I think that was, yes, I think there was going to be the delicate Miss Lamb.
Yes, and Miss Lamb definitely appears quite strongly in the miniseries.
Yeah.
But
Miss Lamb is not a slave of any kind. She's terribly rich.
Yeah.
And they all suck up to her, don't they?
No, but I wonder whether Jane Austen used Dido, who was no longer a slave, was she? By the time.
No.
Whether she used her as her model for Miss Lamb.
What do you think, Karin?
It's just a thought.
It was very different because, as if I remember, in Sanditon, everyone, Miss Lamb is richer than anybody at all. Well, Dido was not in that position. I don't think there are that much parallels, except
just
for colour.
Maybe the seed of an idea.
Maybe.
It certainly seems possible, doesn't it? That
yes.
She could easily have.
Yes.
I've got a question here from Eleanor. There was a film called Belle recently. Was it based on Dido?
Yes.
The answer is yes, it was. I think actually I saw it, and it was quite interesting.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody else?
I'm invisible because I haven't turned my video on. But
who is that? Where are you?
You can't see me. But my question really is about Sanditon, which I saw on. I think they had a televised series of Sanditon, which I watched, which was thoroughly interesting. And I'm just wondering whether, you know, I mean, the characterization of Miss Lamb was quite, I mean, she wasn't a very pleasant character. I'm just reflecting on that. And the other thing that struck me was the heroine of the story. I was wondering whether there was some story about her. Was she a legitimate daughter of her father?
Oh,
because throughout the portrayal in that televised series, she seemed to be sort of an outsider to society.
Well, I must say,
she's an heiress, isn't she, Miss Lamb?
Who? Not Miss Lamb. I'm talking about the heroine of Sanditon.
Charlotte Haywood.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't pick that up at all. Maybe I'm sorry. I didn't get that. But maybe there is something in the television production which was different.
Yes, perhaps. She was distinctly portrayed as someone on the outside looking in.
Yeah.
Diana, our friend from Ohio has sent you in a comment on this subject.
Yes, I can see it. Dido is black, Miss Lamb is black. Money only took you so far. They both seem to be put on display. That's a very pertinent point, I think. Well, now we've reached 9 o'clock, and I think we could probably go on for another half hour at least. But poor Karin is waiting for her dinner.
No, I'm not at all.
We do have to bring this to a conclusion. It has been a really, really good evening. Thank you to Karin for a wonderful talk. Really, really excellent, really informative. And thank everybody here for making the question and answers so good. I'm sorry that we do have to bring it to an end, but thank you again. Thank you to Andreas for masterminding things behind the scene. And once again, thank you very much for coming. And we do have a final evening tomorrow. We've got a light-hearted quiz at 5 o'clock. You'll know all the answers. Do not be afeared. And then at 7:30, we've got our final evening of readings. It's Jane Austen's own words to end our week of events. So I do hope I'll see some of you for that. Thank you again for joining us, and a very good night to everyone. Thank you, Karin.
Good night. Good night. Thank you. Thank you, Diana. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Yes, indeed.
Night, night.
Good night.